Hello everyone, and welcome back to the Ultimate Super Nintendo review here on Player One Start. In the previous parts in this series, we took a look at the launch of the Super Famicom in Japan. Then I covered the history and the redesign of the console as it made its way over to the United States as the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. I also tore down the system and explained how the graphics on the Super Nintendo works, and in this video I'm going to take a look at the sound chip and how it was utilized to make games very memorable on the Super Nintendo. When the Super Famicom launched in 1990, Nintendo had a huge advantage over the competition simply by being last to market and being able to see what the competition had to offer. Starting back in 1983 though with the original Famicom, Nintendo had gone with an FM synthesis chip that was able to do 5 sounds at once or have 5 voices or channels. Each of the 5 channels were dedicated to making only one type of sound, which I covered in detail in the Ultimate Nintendo Entertainment System review and 8-Bit War. From these limitations, Nintendo saw a huge need to upgrade their sound chip, especially when seeing what was used in the other consoles. NEC broke into the console market in 1987 in Japan, and they used a wavetable lookup synthesis sound system in their PC engine. Essentially, the sound chip would use samples, but it was very limited in what it could do. The Sega Genesis would include a much upgraded YM2612 in their Sega Mega Drive and the Sega Genesis here in the US, but in order to maintain backwards compatibility, it would also contain the same sound system used in the Master System as well, which would add to its 6 voices for a total of 10. The YM2612 was developed by Yamaha and was used in several arcade games of the 1980s, and with Sega wanting to give their system more of a leg up on arcade games, this seemed natural in their direction to go, and I did cover this in greater detail in the Ultimate Sega Genesis review, but for our purposes here, I will note that this was mainly an FM synthesis, and to get sound samples to play on the Genesis was a difficult process. As Nintendo wanted to directly compete with Sega, they also decided to partner with an outside company, this time being Sony. At the time, Sony was known as the premier company for premium audio equipment and audio sound chips. Back in the late 80s, Sony was known for their speakers, receivers, and probably best known by consumers for their Walkman, Discman, and headphones. The lead person from Sony in charge of this chip would be Ken Kutaragi, a name which will resurface again as we talk about the history of video games on this channel. And to understand why the SNES sound chip is designed as it is, we should probably take a look at a few things that were relevant around the time period. Number 1 being the prices for chips and memory were going way down at the end of the 1980s. In the later part of the 1980s, there were massive chip shortages that were causing problems all throughout the video game industry. This caused prices of chips to go up until this was resolved around 1989. So at the time of designing this chip, prices for things like RAM and memory were going down. Most video game sound chips of this time period were using synthesis to imitate sounds of instruments. However, it was now becoming economical to be able to provide sound samples on the chip instead of synthesis. For example, instead of using a waveform to simulate a piano, you can just simply record a piano key and input that into the chip. The Famicom Disk System that was only released in Japan also used a version of wavetable lookup synthesis. This gave some of those games a more rich sound, and Nintendo and the industry thought that this method of sound production would be the future in the industry, so an evolution of this concept for the next console was on their mind. What has been well noted about the Super Nintendo sound chip is just how far above and beyond the Call of Duty Ken Kutaragi would decide to go. Where the PC Engine, TurboGrafx, and Sega Genesis would have an audio chip, the Super Nintendo would have an entire audio subsystem, labeled the Nintendo SMP. This impressive chip was made up of its own 8-bit processor, which had to be programmed separately from the main system, a digital signal processor, and its own 64 kilobyte pool of RAM. This would allow for more and better quality sound samples to be used on the Super Nintendo than the PC Engine. And by having its own processor built into this chip, they would not have to rely on the Super Nintendo's admittedly slow CPU, which would become a bottleneck in many games, but they wouldn't have to worry about the sound. At the end, what came out of this project was a sound chip capable of 8 voices of stereo sound, which could be used as 4 voices on the right channel, 4 voices on the left, or 8 channels of mono. All sound would be generated from samples, which would sound great for modern music, but it wouldn't be so good at simulating the synthesis part. It also included other features that were much welcome to make sounds on the Super Nintendo sound very good. As I noted in some of my previous videos, my Super Famicom had a completely separate soundboard, which I believe is a result of the fact that the sound chip didn't have its design finalized before the rest of the system, leading them to have this extension board in early models, but by the time it came over to the US, my early model childhood Super Nintendo has it as being integrated on the rest of the board. But when looking for games that have exceptional soundtracks, the Super Nintendo does not slouch in this department. There are very numerous examples to pull from, but when I think of high-quality sounds that came out of the Super Nintendo, for some reason, my mind always goes to the game Super Adventure Island. Super Adventure Island had its soundtrack composed by industry legend Yuzo Koshiro, who would also compose the soundtrack for the Streets of Rage games on the Genesis. When listening to this soundtrack, I feel like I'm not listening to a video game, but more or less to a CD from the early 90s. The music from this game does not really seem like it would match up with a fantasy island setting, but more or less something you might hear played in a dance club in early 90s New York City. In fact, that's my only criticism of this soundtrack, is that it feels like it doesn't belong. Nevertheless, this really shows off what talented programmers and composers could do to get high-quality sounding music out of this chip back at a time when this was the only way that people experienced sound in games. Each tune is catchy and doesn't overstay its welcome, so you're not distressed at having to listen to the same sounds over and over again. The tempo was very fast in each song, keeping you anxious and on the edge of your seat, very aware of what's going on in the game. And I feel these are things that are lost in modern video games that you just don't get out of a video game soundtrack in modern games. And some of you out there may be thinking, well, big deal, Tyler, I've heard better music from other systems of this same time period. I've heard some people even refer to the Commodore Amiga. But I think this track in particular showcases something that just wasn't well done on any other system of the time. What I am specifically referring to here are the low bass notes. Very low bass notes like these is an impressive achievement on this system, considering that they don't have a lot of memory to work with, and these samples often take up a lot of memory, and don't get compressed well, leading to a lot of game programmers not even attempting something like this. But here they seem to be pulled off flawlessly. Two things I want to note before we move on is that if you're listening to this on a cell phone speaker, you're not getting the full experience. Definitely play this on like your home theater surround system and crank up the bass and you'll hear exactly what I'm talking about. Also, I am by no means an expert on how sound chips generate sound, so there may be other examples of this, maybe even better on the Super Nintendo, but I remember this game being a defining moment in my life where I not only first noticed the importance of a video game soundtrack, I found a game soundtrack I would listen to without playing the game. I had this game's soundtrack on CD for many years, and I had played it for several people, none of which could believe it came out of a Super Nintendo. But of course, when looking for the maximum capability of this sound chip, I don't think you need to look any further than the Donkey Kong Country series. How the composer David Wise was able to get the Super Nintendo sound chip to produce the sounds heard in Donkey Kong Country could be a video of its own. In fact, several others have already tackled this subject in great detail. The only thing I'm going to say is that the reason why there aren't too many games with a soundtrack like this is because of how incredibly difficult it was to pull off. One story I am particularly fond of is the one where David Wise explains how he had to program bit by bit the track of Aquatic Ambiance. As I briefly touched on before, one of the major weaknesses of the Super Nintendo sound chip is that it didn't handle wave synthesis well. However, David Wise found a way to overcome that limitation by having a scaling wave synthesis form play throughout the background of this track, and it is a monumental achievement that this track exists on the system. There are many other great tracks from the Donkey Kong Country series as well, and although I'm not going to play all of them, I am going to play a few of my personal favorites. Through this sampling, you can hear a lot of music that just doesn't sound like any other music on this platform. But even still, most of my favorite tracks from the Donkey Kong Country series was actually not from this game, but from its sequel, which I believe has one of the best opening title sequences in any video game ever. Fan expectations for Donkey Kong Country 2 were extremely high, especially after the huge success of the first game. I don't think pirate culture has ever really gone out of fashion, and this game definitely hits that theme very hard throughout the entire game, but right from the get-go, that heavy pirate theme that plays during the beginning will let you know that this will be an adventure you will not soon forget. But it's not just pirate themes that would make this game memorable in my opinion, but I think the theme that most of you will recognize from this game is Sticker Brush Symphony. A surprising bit of trivia about this musical piece is that it was almost cut from the game, as it was originally meant to accompany a water level that got the axe. Must have been something about water-themed levels that really inspired composer David Wise. But as those of us that have already played this level already know, the calm and persistent melody amongst such difficult platforming really made these levels stand out to me as a kid when I would rent this game, and even though these levels would usually end my run before I'd have to return the game back to the video game store, I never really felt too frustrated with the game to where I wanted to give it up completely, and I think that's entirely due to the theme in these levels. And apparently I'm not the only one that thought this way, as this track is very well regarded amongst many retro gamers who grew up playing this game. Of course, this isn't the only memorable track. Let's go ahead and listen to a few of the popular ones, along with some of my personal favorites. Crook's March here is really one that I like to point out in this system, as a lot of gamers I don't think have heard this track, especially if they haven't made it to the later levels. The marching theme in this track really keeps you on your toes, as you definitely have to keep going through each of these levels, as you're not really given much time to think. But then this later part of the song, where it really shows you the sense of impending doom that you are in the toughest part of the game, I don't know what it is, but it kind of sends chills down my spine. And out of all of the compressed sounds used to make this song, I think that this instrument, I think it's a clarinet, but I'm not a musical person, so I'm not really 100% sure. All I know is that it sounds very realistic. I have seen some gamers and reviewers write off the third Donkey Kong Country as not being worth the time to play, as it is not as good as the other two. And while I do agree partially that it's not as good as the other two, I still think it provides a fun experience and is definitely worth playing. But one of the more common criticisms I hear is that the music just isn't as immersive as the other two games, and in this case I definitely agree as well, but there are a few tracks in this game that I feel are worth mentioning, so let's go ahead and take a listen. Of course, Donkey Kong Country is not the only game that had an amazing soundtrack. Another famous composer from this system is Nobuo Uematsu, who composed music for the Final Fantasy series. His work on the first three Final Fantasy games were impressive, especially for the limitations of that system, but where I feel he really begins to shine is with Final Fantasy II, also known as Final Fantasy IV in Japan. The whole game's soundtrack is almost a masterpiece in itself, but this track right here, Theme of Love, is very highly regarded as one of the first video game tracks to break through in popular culture. This song has had several rearrangements throughout the Final Fantasy series, but has also been covered by numerous live performances as well. And while there are many factors that contributed to the success of the Final Fantasy series, I think at the top of that list you can put the musical score. Especially in these early games when that was the only sound you got out of the game. No voiceover performances here or full video cutscenes. As much as I admire Final Fantasy II's soundtrack, Final Fantasy III's soundtrack is 10 times better, at least in my opinion. Terra's theme, played right at the beginning of this game, is still my favorite almost out of every Final Fantasy. There's only a couple that I think could take the spot of this one. Final Fantasy III was also very experimental with its soundtrack and very ambitious with its story. In fact, this is the first Final Fantasy game that I could recall that would integrate the game's soundtrack into the game's story. Fans of this game will know what I'm talking about with the opera scene. The fact that this was even attempted on the Super Nintendo's hardware that was definitely not able to handle a lot of voice samples just goes to show how talented the game's programmers and the game's musician had to be able to fit this all into one game cartridge. And this is one of those things that created a very memorable gameplay experience the first time I played through this game. And of course, there are so many other great composers and tracks that I could go on all day mentioning. However, to keep things relatively brief, I am just going to go through and showcase some of the ones that are viewed as some of the best on the system, as well as a few of my personal favorites thrown in. The story behind the Super Nintendo's sound chip is actually an interesting one. It is the only story with Nintendo and Sony that has a happy ending. In other words, the two companies collaborated and Nintendo actually released the product in the end. They would collaborate on another project later on, but that is a story for a future video. Getting back to the tech specs of the sound chip, this is just something that is leaps and bounds better than I remember it being as a kid. In terms of FM synthesis, every other console had a leg up on the Super Nintendo. But in terms of just sampled sound generation, the Super Nintendo sound chip was incredibly powerful. But the main limiting factor was that 64 kilobytes of RAM that just wasn't enough to store a variety of sound samples, and the fact that all of these companies, like Rare in particular, and the composer for Donkey Kong Country, was able to get some of those sounds out of the chip. I mean, it's really mind-blowing that they were able to program that in, and it creates an astonishing result. Really capable sound chip. And as I look at the time counter on this video, it looks like we'll have to wrap things up here. But in the next video, we're going to showcase some of the maximum capabilities of this console's sound chip and graphics chip with some tech demos, as well as taking a look at its hardware revision. If you like this video and you'd like to help out with future projects on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. A special thanks to those Patreons you see on screen. Also, if you like what you see, please remember to leave a like and click that subscribe button on your way out. As always, I want to thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.